These 80s movies had wooden swords, $50 budgets, and actors who couldn't act. But they also had more nudity than a Playboy Mansion, more gore than a slasher film, and somehow all made it to theaters. Let me show you the wildest R-rated fantasy films you've probably never heard of. In 1986, Roger Corman produced Amazons. A sorcerer king attacks an Amazon village, and there's a prophecy that only the chosen one with a sacred sword can stop him. So this Amazon warrior Diala and her companion Tashi go on a quest to find the sword. They fight snake cultists, rescue each other from getting sacrificed, and work their way toward confronting the sorcerer king. All the fighters here are women except the villain. Sounds like it could be progressive, right? Years later, Corman tried to claim exactly that. Said Amazons was his Xena, the warrior princess. Said it predicted the 90s show. Which is funny because the Amazons in his movie wear leather bikinis, and the whole thing is just an excuse to show women with their tops off. There's this long scene where Diala gets captured and tied up topless and almost sacrificed to a man-eating tree. Someone called it a barbarian boob fest, and yeah, that's what it is. Every other scene has someone bathing or changing clothes. The weird part is, this is actually one of Corman's better fantasy movies from the 80s. The script was based on a real short story by fantasy writer Charles Saunders, so it has slightly more structure than his other stuff. The acting still sucks and the effects are terrible, but at least there's a story holding it together. Two bodybuilder twins, Peter and David Paul, play barbarian brothers trying to save a princess. The director is Ruggero Deodato, the guy who made Cannibal Holocaust, so you'd think this would be brutal and serious. But the twins read the script and thought it was garbage. David Paul said it was so bad, full of dumb dialogue, that didn't work. So they made a call. The only way to make this watchable was to turn it into a comedy. And they just did it. Started improvising funny stuff. Played their characters like lovable morons instead of serious warriors. Basically rewrote the tone of the entire movie while they were shooting. The Italian crew didn't realize what was happening. Deodato thought he was making a real fantasy epic. Meanwhile, the twins are cracking jokes and goofing around, changing the whole film right under his nose. David Paul said later they should have gotten story credit for how much they contributed. They essentially hijacked the movie. It bombed in America because Cannon Films was going under at the time, but it was huge overseas. Played for months in some countries, and it became this cult thing eventually. People loved how goofy it was. The twins were actually proud of that. They'd taken a bad serious movie and turned it into a fun dumb one on purpose. There's technically a plot here about a warrior collecting 3 magic items to beat a sorcerer. Along the way, he fights ogres, witches, and participates in a gladiatorial tournament. But Corman himself said his approach was to give people a ready supply of bare-breasted women and bloody sword fights, and he did exactly that. He made it in Argentina for basically no money, reused sets from other movies he'd shot, cast Playboy playmates for the sex appeal. One of them was Lana Clarkson. She was 6 feet tall and did her own stunts. There's a scene where she fights a tentacle monster in a real swamp, and apparently it was awful to shoot. And here's the best part. They finished the rough cut and showed it to Corman. He watched it and said it needed more nudity. So they went back and shot even more topless scenes and cut them into the movie. Deathstalker became a cable classic. They made 3 sequels. Even compared to other cheap fantasy movies, it had a reputation for being sleazy. But that was the whole point. 4 years later, Jim Wynorski shows up in Argentina to direct Deathstalker 2. First thing he does is read the script, and he realizes it's awful, just completely terrible. So Wynorski throws it out. He decides he's going to rewrite the entire movie from scratch. Every single night, Wynorski and the lead actor John Terlesky would sit in their hotel room and write the next day's scenes. They weren't trying to make a serious fantasy film anymore. They were pulling gags from Abbott and Costello and jokes from old Warner Brothers cartoons, whatever they thought was funny. Wynorski said they did their version of It Happened One Night. That's the Frank Capra movie from the 30s that won an Oscar. Except instead of a romantic comedy, it's got swords and sorcerers and Amazon warriors. The budget was so cheap that all the swords in the movie are painted wood. And there's this magical crystal ball that's supposed to be important to the plot, but it's actually a glass doorknob. The whole movie became a self-aware comedy. The plot is about rogue Deathstalker teaming up with a seer to fight an evil sorcerer and his clone army. But none of it really matters because everyone's just having fun. It flopped at the box office but became a cult favorite with B-movie fans who got what it was doing. Paul Verhoeven and Rutger Hauer had made 5 films together. They had this whole creative partnership, successful films in the Netherlands. Then they made Flesh and Blood. And they didn't work together again for 20 years. Verhoeven wanted to make a brutal, unflinching movie about medieval mercenaries. Show the Middle Ages as disgusting reality with mud and disease and violence. Rutger Hauer had just come off playing a romantic hero in Ladyhawke. He wanted his character Martin to be more conventionally heroic. Verhoeven wanted him to be a morally ambiguous anti-hero. They fought constantly on set. Verhoeven said later that they hated each other by the end, couldn't stand each other anymore. The movie itself is exactly what you'd expect from Verhoeven. A band of mercenaries led by Martin gets double-crossed by their lord, so they kidnap a noblewoman named Agnes, played by Jennifer Jason Leigh, and hole up in a plague-ravaged castle. There's graphic violence, graphic sex, and a twisted love triangle between Martin, Agnes, and her betrothed nobleman Stephen. Lucio Fulci made a bunch of gory cult films, and he thought Conquest was going to be his breakout, the thing that would get him into mainstream fantasy and elevate his whole career. Instead, absolutely everything went wrong. First, Fulci parted ways with Giordano Sacchetti. That was his longtime writing partner. They'd worked together for years. Sacchetti felt betrayed that Fulci was doing this project without him. He sued, and their collaboration ended permanently. Then the budget turned out to be way smaller than Fulci expected. He thought he was getting real money to make a proper fantasy epic. Instead, they had to cut corners everywhere with cheap props and reused costumes. The movie is set in a mystical prehistoric world. There's a young archer who teams up with a seasoned warrior to defeat an evil sorceress. The sorceress appears completely nude except for a metal skull mask. The whole thing plays out like a collection of violent fantasy sequences one after another. Within the first few minutes, werewolf creatures tear a woman in half on screen, and the hero gets beheaded halfway through the movie. It's relentlessly grotesque, more like a gory, dark fantasy trip than any kind of heroic adventure. Conan the Barbarian made $100 million in 1982, and every low-budget producer in the world decided they could make their own version but cheaper. This is one of them. This Italian production came out the same year as Conan, and it's your standard revenge plot. Evil fire goddess destroys a village, barbarian prince named Sangral goes on a quest to get revenge, finds a mystical ark that'll give him power. Along the way, he gets crucified, fights blind cavemen and tree men, and teams up with a wise Asian archer. Nothing original about any of it. The guy playing Sangral was a former Mr. Universe contestant who'd been working as a stuntman. He'd never acted before, and you can tell because his entire performance is just grunting and swinging a sword around. The movie's cheap and lurid and knows exactly what it is. David Carradine stars here as a wandering swordsman on a desert planet with 2 sons. He shows up in a town where 2 warlords control the only water well, and he plays them against each other. It's Yojimbo transplanted to a cheap sci-fi setting. They basically lifted scene for scene from Kurosawa's film, except with way more nudity. Nearly every woman in it is topless for no story reason whatsoever. By some counts, it has more nudity than any other Corman sword and sorcery film. The original title was Kane of Dark Planet. Roger Corman changed it to The Warrior and the Sorceress before release, even though there's barely any sorcery in the actual movie. The title character doesn't really do magic. Corman wanted that title specifically so he could put a half-naked sorceress on the poster to sell tickets. His whole philosophy was once people pay and sit down, it doesn't matter what's actually in the film. The movie became notorious for one thing though, the 4-breasted exotic dancer. That's basically a ripoff of the cantina scene from Return of the Jedi. Lana Clarkson stars as Amathea, a barbarian queen whose village gets destroyed on her wedding day. Her fiancé is captured and she gathers warrior women to infiltrate the tyrant city and free her people. Clarkson was 6 feet tall and imposing, so the marketing sold her as a female Conan, fierce warrior woman leading a revenge mission against an empire. That's what people expected when they bought tickets. What they got was completely different. Within the first 10 minutes, there's a graphic assault scene. Throughout the movie, Amathea and her companions are subjected to constant sexual violence, gang, torture, degradation. The film runs 70 minutes, and a huge portion of that is just brutality presented as entertainment. Clarkson spends more time being tortured and stripped than actually fighting. People showed up expecting a badass warrior woman adventure and got a series of assault scenarios instead. Sorceress has a completely bonkers plot. Evil sorcerer's twin daughters are prophesied to overthrow him, so he orders them killed as babies. They get saved and raised as boys without knowing they're actually girls. They grow up to be warrior women, then one gets captured for a virgin sacrifice and the other has to rescue her. There's also zombies and a laser-shooting flying lion god. Roger Corman cast identical twin Playboy playmates as the leads. They couldn't act at all. The effects were laughable and the whole thing plays like a parody, even though it wasn't meant to be one. What makes this one interesting is the director Jack Hill, the guy who made Coffee and Switchblade Sisters. Respected exploitation filmmaker. This was his final feature. Hill delivered his cut and Corman decided it needed more spice. He ordered additional nude scenes and had editors trim the runtime down to 83 minutes. When Hill saw the final version, he was so upset he disowned it.